Bonjour, good morning to everybody in Canada and overseas. I'm Jacques Tijan Bangura, Chair of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council in Ottawa. On behalf of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and the Africa Study Group, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable on the topic, the Wagner Group in Africa. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting from Ottawa on the traditional unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe. In our events, the Africa Study Group deals with various themes through a series of discussions, including the strengthening of Canada-Africa relations, the role and importance of the Canadian-African diaspora, issues relating to the Africa Free Trade area, aspect of the global issues of climate change, as well as question security and stabilization as an essential condition for sustainable development. This session is part of our series of discussion on security and stabilization in Africa. In this context, our previous discussions have covered topics such as unconstitutional changes of government, the impact of violent extremists and terrorists in Africa, so here this, and security and governance in the Sahel following the withdrawal of French forces from Mali. Today, we are talking about Wagner in Africa. The recent death of the leader of the Wagner Group has put diverse question marks. Our panelists will tackle the history and possibly the future of the group in Africa for a variety of angles. This webinar will be moderated by Dr. Marcia Burdette, the Deputy Chair of the Africa Study Group. With a PhD in the political science from Columbia University in New York, 1979, Marcia Burdette pursued an academic career, followed by 25 years with the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has a long-standing interest in Africa, in particular Central Southern Africa. Her book, Zambia Between Two Worlds, and a series of articles focus on the major economic transition of the country when its new leaders embarked on the nationalization of the copper industry, the country's main economic engine. Subsequent articles dealt with input industry for Zimbabwe agriculture sector in the 1980s and 1990s. Without any delay, I will now hand over to Marcia.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Good afternoon and good evening to our friends and colleagues in Africa and Europe, some panelists, as well as audience from those parts of the world. My name is Marcia Burdette. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Africa Study Group. And I want to just say a few words first, and then we will get into the introduction of our wonderful panel today. We in the Africa Study Group have been working on a roundtable on this topic for a while. And we realized that as there was more and more information concerning the Wagner Group in Africa and obviously in Ukraine, this would be of main interest to our audience. So the panelists today, we're going to talk about the evolution of Wagner in Africa, in Russia, its recent history in the Sahelian band across Africa, and then its short period of engagement in Mozambique. And today, for a brief period of time, Jeff York, the Globe and Mail correspondent, previously based in Johannesburg, now based in Jerusalem, is coming on and using some of his precious time in his very busy schedule to participate today. So let me start. Mercenaries, which is basically what Wagner are, have a long and inglorious history in Africa. The Wagner Group has earned public attention because of its overt sponsorship by Russia and its strategy of linking military deployments with commercial benefits. Its varied military, economic, political presence in Africa has included Libya, Mali, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, Central African Republic, a bit in Kenya, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mozambique, Madagascar, and Zimbabwe. The recent apparent death of the founder, Prigozhin, has put a question mark over the future of the group in Africa or after Prigozhin in Africa. Today's panelists are going to tackle the history and possibly the future of the Wagner Group from a variety of angles. Let me just say this roundtable was conducted in a hybrid fashion. So we have an in-person audience here at NPSIA in Carleton University, as well as an large online audience. We will try to blend together questions from the panelists, from the in-person audience, and also those who send questions online in French or in English. You can be sending online questions via the Q&A box on the Zoom system. And we will try to blend some of that in questions for the panelists at the end. So now let me introduce our three main speakers. First of all will be Leigh Sarty. Leigh is an adjunct professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and is senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, where we are today. He is also a senior fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary History at the University of Toronto. His career at Global Affairs Canada included postings at the Canadian Embassy in Moscow and in Beijing, where he headed the political section. Back in Ottawa, in the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, he was the Director General for Europe before serving as the Global Affairs Scholar in Residence until his retirement in 2021. He holds an MA from Carleton University and a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Our second speaker is sitting to my left, and that is Douglas Scott Proudfoot. Scott joined the Department of External Affairs in 1987. At headquarters, he was the director of the Afghanistan Task Force and then the Sudan Task Force. Overseas, he served in Nairobi, New Delhi, Vienna, London, and Ramallah. And in his last posting was there representing Canada to the Palestinian Authority. More recently, he was ambassador to South Sudan, and before leaving the Canadian Foreign Service in 2022, he served as the temporary head of mission in Bamako in 2021. He holds a BA in philosophy from the University of Toronto and MA in Renaissance history from McGill. Our third speaker, who will be online, is Borges Nyamirin. Borges is a consultant to the Canadian Bilateral Development Program in Mozambique. He's a journalist and a researcher with over 15 years of experience in Mozambican politics and governance. Borges holds an international relations and diplomacy degree from the Higher Institute of International Relations, Maputo, a law degree from the School of Law at Eduardo de Mondlane University, Maputo, and an MSc in Security Studies at the Universidad Joaquim Chissano, Maputo. His recent work experience includes as a research consultant with the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, as Mozambique's correspondent for Bloomberg News, and as researcher in governance with the Maputo-based think tank Center for Public Integrity. Well, without further delay, I'm now going to hand over to our first speaker, Leigh Sarty.
Thank you very much. I assume everyone can hear me, otherwise there'd be appalled looks from the panel. So good. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join you from distant Westboro, about 8 kilometers away. And I'm mindful that I've been asked to speak about issues important to Africa before an audience that can claim much more knowledge of that continent than I ever could. So that's why I'm going to focus my remarks on a subject that I do know something about, Russia, in a way that I do hope you'll all find useful. And understanding the role of Russia and the storied mercenary firm Wagner in Africa is not only useful, it's absolutely fascinating. It presents us with a vivid juxtaposition of the high and the low, of high geopolitics on the one hand, and low skullduggery on the other. And both attributes epitomize the basic drivers of Putin's Russia and its aspirations on the world stage. What I plan to do is to take just a couple of minutes to give you a crash course in Putinism, and then spend the rest of my allotted time describing how it has applied to Africa, with special reference to the Wagner Group, and conclude with some very brief thoughts about the post-Prigozhin future. Needless to say, I'll be delighted to touch further on any or all of this during our discussion. For Vladimir Putin, foreign policy is all about the West. Now, I don't want to get lost in semantics, but I appreciate that the West can be a contentious term. For my purposes, the West includes the developed democracies of Europe, North America, and the Pacific, by far the most prominent of which, certainly in Russian eyes, is the United States. Preoccupation with a West that is economically and technologically superior is not a recent phenomenon. It has been the defining condition of Russia's development for half a millennium. Under Putin, however, against the very complicated backdrop of the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, that preoccupation has taken the form of an ever deeper resentment at a West that, in the Kremlin's view, writes the rules of world politics as it sees fit, and fails to give Moscow the respect it is due as a great power. During the war that Russia unleashed in Ukraine, these sentiments have morphed into the frankly hysterical assertion that the West seeks nothing less than Russia's total destruction. Pushing back at every opportunity, working alone and with China and with others to weaken and divide the West, to tip the global scales in a more favorable direction, is thus the overarching goal of Russian foreign policy. It serves both to advance Moscow's interests as it understands them and to enhance the legitimacy of Putin's authoritarian regime. And this is where Africa comes in. But first, one further word on Putinism. We often hear Russia described as a mafia state, in the context, for example, of the brutal justice that was meted out against Prigozhin last August. And while it's generally best to be wary of journalistic shorthand, sorry, Jeff, if you're listening, the dark mix of corruption, crime, and personalized politics we associate with the term mafia can in fact be said to constitute the very essence of Putinism. Putin's formative post-Soviet experience was his tenure as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, Russia's second largest city and a major transportation hub from 1991 to 1996. As head of the City Committee for Foreign Relations, Putin was a linchpin in the complex networks of shady deals and official corruption that characterized Russia's transition to a market economy. His ability to, quote unquote, manage business on behalf of the state while enriching himself and others won him the nod for his move to Moscow and eventual rise to the top. Corruption, criminality, and a blurring of the line between public and private have thus always been integral to the Putin system. And so it's no surprise to see these same traits manifested in Russia's engagement in Africa, and indeed epitomized by the most prominent instrument of that engagement, Wagner. Wagner itself is an extremely murky entity. Remember that private military companies, or PMCs, the Russians love acronyms, remain illegal in the country. Prigozhin himself denied any connection until 2022. Wagner seems to have been founded around 2013 by one Dmitry Utkin, a former Russian military intelligence officer who named the group to honor Adolf Hitler's favorite composer, which tells you something about what a nice guy Utkin was. He went down in the same plane as Prigozhin in August. The first active deployment of Wagner troops was in the early spring of 2014, when they accompanied the ensignless Little Green Men who seized Crimea. The group first made international headlines in February 2018, when up to 300 Wagner troops were killed in a firefight with US forces in eastern Syria. Those troops were trying to seize a Conoco plant that services the oil fields there, which speaks to a key aspect of the group's modus operandi in Africa, providing security and other quote-unquote services to corrupt regimes in return for access to natural resources. Moscow's military intervention in Syria, which began in September 2015, was driven by its determination to push back against international condemnation of its 2014 actions in Ukraine, to assert Russia's status as both a great power and a reliable bulwark of those who oppose the West. And it's these same geopolitical considerations that explain Russia's return to Africa, which began at roughly the same time with its support for Haftar and the LNA in Libya. The rest, as the saying goes, is history, with Russian and Wagner involvement, as was cited at the outset, both past and present, now documented right across the continent, from Libya to the Sahel to Madagascar and Mozambique. I'm often struck by the continuities in the history of East-West relations, and the legacy of the Soviet period in Africa, is a fascinating case in point. The heyday of Soviet involvement on the continent began in the 1960s, when it presented itself as a baggage-free alternative to newly independent states seeking to distance themselves from the colonial powers of the West. Contemporary Russian diplomacy in Africa plays shamelessly on this legacy. Moscow presents itself as the champion of sovereignty, which is code for looking the other way on issues like human rights and commercial transparency, which it contrasts with the meddlesome behavior of former colonizers such as France. Remarks by the head of the Transitional Legislative Assembly of the Republic of Burkina Faso in Moscow just last March capture this perfectly. It is very important for Burkina Faso, he said, that Russia builds its relations on the principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. And I quote, "Our historical counterpart, France, unfortunately did not meet our expectations, and we really do not want history to repeat itself. Therefore, we really hope that our cooperation with Russia will be successful for us." Wagner fits beautifully into this agenda. Not only do its representatives provide physical security for dictators and their entourages, they provide a variety of support services for authoritarian regimes, including social media broadcasting and content that bolsters regime legitimacy at the West's expense. Don't forget that the infamous Internet Research Agency, fingered in US election interference in 2016, was a Prigozhin operation. But the biggest upside is arguably the financial one, the enabling role that Wagner-affiliated shell companies play in assisting corrupt African elites to pillage oil, gas, gold, diamonds, and other natural riches for their personal benefit. it is worth underlining how solidly such skullduggery, as I'm calling it, is hardwired into the Putin regime. The skills honed during Russia's Wild West capitalism of the 1990s applied on the world stage. Let me give just one representative example, detailed by the Organized Crime and Corruption Research Project. Its authors have documented how Prigozhin's firm M Invest agreed in 2018 to pay a security company run by Sudanese military intelligence $200,000 upfront and $100,000 a month thereafter in return for services, including weapons contracts, visas, and transportation on military aircraft. In return, the Sudanese presidency kindly waived the Ministry of Minerals' legal right to 30% of the earnings from gold mining licenses granted to M Invest's Mero Gold. And the deal reportedly persisted after al-Bashir was removed from office in 2019. Estimates of the windfall for Russian entities from comparable deals, wherever Wagner is active on the continent, run in the low billions of dollars. Their corrupt African counterparts reap their own benefits, financial and otherwise. The only losers are their poorly governed publics. It's important to underline the complexity of these operations. The Wagner PMC is ultimately just one cog in a web of companies affiliated with Prigozhin's Concord Group. This typically Putinist personalization of power means that securing the future of Wagner without Prigozhin is a more complicated proposition than one might think. But the benefits to the Russian state are ultimately such that I would bet that Moscow proves to be up to the task. Deputy Defense Minister Yunusbek Yevkurov's September travel to Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic signaled Russia's intent to assert a more prominent role for the Ministry of Defense. And then President Putin's public meeting on September 28th with Yevkurov and Andrei Troshev, a retired colonel who reportedly oversaw Wagner's military operations, has been reported as sealing Wagner's future as a de facto arm of the Russian Ministry of Defense. As I hope I've made clear, both the Russian authorities and their African counterparts have a strong interest in ensuring that their win-win cooperation in both the high and the low realms of Wagner's past activities continues. A recent piece by Joseph Siegel for the US DoD Africa Center suggests, however, that, and I quote, Russia's reach in Africa may be exceeding its grasp, with the growing realization of how little Russia actually brings to Africa, given that its role ultimately is that of, and I quote Siegel, an amplifier of instability on the continent. The question of Russia's and Wagner's future in Africa is thus ultimately rests on whether or not that realization gains traction, enough traction to generate some real pushback against the dynamics I've been describing. And this seems as good a place as any for me to conclude my remarks and turn the floor over to those better placed to speak to this aspect of the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leigh. That was an interesting presentation, and I'm sure that's going to generate a lot of questions. But for now, we'll turn to the second speaker, Scott Proudfoot.
Thanks, Marcia. I was talking a few weeks ago to my former thesis supervisor, and he told me an anecdote about having been in Paris in May 1968. And as you know, France at the time was in turmoil. He was there to go to the National Archives. His area of research was the transatlantic slave trade. But the archives were closed, and the archivists were on strike. And there was a group of archivists outside, and they were singing L'Internationale. And he said to them, why are you singing L'Internationale? You're unionized, but your union isn't affiliated with the CGT. What does this mean? And they replied, les autres, ceux qui appuient le général, eux, ils chantent la Marseillaise. Alors, faut que nous chantons l'Internationale. In other words, l'Internationale was the default alternative to the Marseillaise. And when he told me this, it reminded me of this topic, because I think this is a bit of the same psychological dynamic, a default alternative, but it's largely symbolic. So I'm going to stress two themes through my remarks here, or two conclusions that I'll bring to, but I'll let you know in advance what they are. The first is, I think what's driving the decision in many African capitals to look at the Wagner option, over and above that symbolism, is a misapprehension that the security problems that countries are facing lend themselves to a military solution. The other is a systemic failure. It's the symptom of a systemic failure by the international community, and particularly Western countries, to address many of the underlying problems and to provide better security. Now, I said some of this is symbolic. Let's talk a bit about the Russian offer. As Leigh mentioned, maybe Russia's reach is exceeding its grasp, and I think that's true, because I don't think the Russian offer, or with even the Wagner component of that Russian offer, is all that attractive. African leaders, and African crowds for that matter, are fairly clear-eyed about what Russia is today. Africa is famously a young continent. 1% of the population of most countries has any memory of the colonial period. Maybe 10% has any memory of the Soviet Union. The crowds in the street are in their 20s. The colonels who took over in Bamako and Niamey recently, and Ouagadougou are in their 30s. And there's a thirst among youth for change. But there are no illusions. Russia has a certain ersatz glamour. But the reality of what Russia is today is apparent. This is a country with half the population of the Soviet Union, with a population a bit bigger than Ethiopia, but rather smaller than Nigeria, with an economy smaller than Canada's, bigger than Spain's, with the world's largest nuclear arsenal for sure, and a veto in the Security Council, but whose conventional capabilities are perhaps not as strong as we might have thought, and which is dependent on its former client states for military equipment. If you want to give two fingers to France, there are a couple of ways to do so. There's a sort of absurd way, Rwanda or Gabon joining the Commonwealth. Or you could cozy up to Russia, even if it doesn't bring you very much. Russia-Africa summits, such as the West Socialist, tend to be fairly well attended. They don't really result in anything, but they signal to Brussels and Paris and Washington that African countries have other options. And one of the things that Russia does bring is a kind of soft power. Not a soft power based on its cultural or scientific achievements, which are impressive, but based on social media and other public domain manipulation. I'll come back to this, because part of the Wagner offer is the money laundering that Leigh described, the military component, but also it's a full service operation, and it gives that kind of info ops support, which might not be available elsewhere. Now, as Marcia mentioned, the presence of mercenaries in Africa is not a recent phenomenon. It goes back to the 60s. Conflict entrepreneurs, you'll remember Bob Denard. In 1989, there was a UN convention on mercenaries. Russia is not a state party to it. It is Canada, for that matter. But we've seen in the past decade this emergence of the Wagner phenomenon. And Leigh spoke a bit about the Libya and Syria experience. Marcia mentioned some countries I wasn't even aware that they were operating, but I'll talk mainly about Mali because it's the one I know best, but touch on some of the others. And I think we'll keep Niger to one side if you want. in the question period, we can talk about the recent events in Niger. I don't know of any evidence that Wagner is going there, but the events of Niger are interesting themselves. First, Sudan, where Wagner was never avowed. They had a niche role guarding Bashir, guarding some resources, money laundering. But then since April of this year, they seem to be providing a role in providing support, indirect support for Hemeti in the RSF. Since about the same time, a larger scale and more avowed presence in Centrafrique, where they began with a training role, but soon got into combat with rebels and financed this with mining concessions, with logging concessions, and it looks like with control over customs revenue. So, a degree of state capture seems to be going. And this should have, in fact, it did, cause alarm bells in many African capitals. Unfortunately, not among certain people in Mali. And one of the things to bear in mind is that the current Minister of Defense in Mali, Sadio Kamara, and the current Prime Minister both studied in Russia. The Prime Minister, Chuego, for over a decade. And there is speculation that one or both of them might be Russian assets. Now, I was going to talk about the historical context in Mali and go through some of the events since 2012, but I think in the interest of time, I'll skip that. If you want to talk more about Mali, we can come back to that. I'll assume a certain knowledge of Mali and its multidimensional crisis. But the one thing I would recall is that in 2012, jihadi movements were marching on Bamako, and one never knows contrafactually what might have happened, but I think there's reason to believe that if it were not for the French intervention in 2012, first by the French Air Force and then by French ground forces, Bamako would have fallen. And if you go back 10 years, France and French were welcomed as saviors. And the same crowds, which are now waving Russian flags, were then waving French flags, same colors, tilted the other way. And of course, then again, I won't go into all the events that led to the coup in 2020, but there was a coup in 2020. It was welcomed, and possibly the unrest which may have precipitated it may have been encouraged by Russian troll farms. Hard to say, but certainly the anti-French sentiment at the time had been stirred up by that. But it wasn't without reason. I can talk more about the neo-colonial presence of France in that region, which has stirred up resentment. Some of it justified, some of it less so. Certainly, while France had kept Mali going in the aftermath of the 2012 upsurge, the decision by Western countries and by ECOWAS, the region, to impose sanctions on the regime stirred resentment. By contrast, we had with Russia that baggage-free offer that Leigh described. And then France decided in 2021 to reduce and eventually withdraw its forces from Mali, Operation Barkhane. It wasn't as dramatic as it looked because it was really just a scaling down and a change of focus, but the rollout of it was terrible. The communications were terrible. It looked to the Malian public and even to Malian leaders who ought to have known better, it looked like it was just abandonment. And meanwhile, as I mentioned, Russian info ops were very active. Appealing to a population which was highly connected. Everybody in African capitals virtually has a smartphone, even in the countryside. It's surprisingly widespread, but which was susceptible to influx. Now, that's not unique to that part of the world. As was mentioned, the American election may have been swayed by Russian info-ops. The so-called Freedom Convoy in Ottawa certainly benefited from Russian info-ops. So one can see that everywhere. But in the spring of 2021, in the summer of 2021, this is when I was there, one started to see rumors of maybe Wagner was coming. And it was denied at first. But then pretty soon on, in September of that year, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov admitted to it. And then there was a lot of speculation about what it meant. And I must say, I got it wrong. I thought the Malian government was bluffing. It didn't seem to make sense. France had made it clear that their continued military presence was incompatible with the presence of Russian mercenaries. And that would mean withdrawal of Barkhane, and there would be a cascading effect. If Barkhane went, inevitably it would mean the rest of the international military presence would end up going too, and that's what's happened. So why would they trade, 15 to 20,000 foreign personnel for 1,000 Russians whom you have to pay for? They're not even free. So I thought maybe, this was an attempt to get some leverage vis-a-vis the region, vis-a-vis ECOWAS, the countries in the region, which were demanding a transition to civilian rule, to buy more time for that transition. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And then I and others thought, well, maybe they're going to bring them in, but it'll be the junta against another coup or some other attack, etc. Well, neither of these took place, and that I think is because of that what I mentioned earlier, that misapprehension that Mali's security problems lend themselves to a military solution. So we saw in 2021 the arrival of Wagner. One doesn't know exactly how many. Estimates are as low as 800, as high as 1,200, probably somewhere in the 1,000 range. A fairly low profile. They're seldom seen in Bamako, but they're in the field very much. I had wondered if at the time of the invasion of Ukraine, whether they would be withdrawn, thinking that Russia would certainly have higher priorities in that situation than this adventure in Mali, but no, they have remained. But they don't seem to have delivered the goods. If after a decade, Barkhane had not succeeded in suppressing the insurgency, what we've seen hitherto from Wagner does not create any expectation. If anything, the situation has continued to deteriorate. And the price to be paid has been serious human rights violations. The best known was a massacre which took place in March 2022 in a town village called Mura near Mopti, where an armed group arrived by helicopter. Malian forces, FAMA, together with armed white soldiers speaking an unknown language. Well, they weren't Icelandic. And over the course of 3 days, they went house to house. They rounded up hundreds of people, mostly men, but some women and children, and conducted summary executions of about 500. And the selection, and this is documented in a UN Office of the Human Rights Commission report, the selection was done by these foreign advisors, probably Wagner. So the situation, this is not a really good way to win hearts and minds. It is intended to instill terror among marginalized populations from whom the jihadi groups, Al-Qaeda and Daesh affiliates are recruiting. But you can't out-terror Al-Qaeda. So it's immoral, but it's also, I believe, going to be unsuccessful in delivering stability or peace to Mali, because the underlying problems cannot be solved militarily. They have to do with marginalization, with local interethnic issues, by a sense that the state is almost an alien institution, and that needs to be addressed piecemeal in the local situations. Mention was made of a plane crash in technical issues.
Sorry.
Mention was made of mention was made of a plane crash in August, in which Prigozhin and Utkin died. I'll mention another plane crash exactly a month later, late September, where an Ilyushin flown by a Belarusian company, apparently chartered by Wagner, crashed down, went off the runway, broke up, killing 140 Russian and Malian personnel. So the investment is there. The results so far, not very impressive. Now, how is this paid for? The number, which is unverified, but is bandied about all the time, is 10 million a month, US. That amounts to somewhere between a quarter and a third of Mali's defense budget. There was speculation at the outset that Wagner would become, or Wagner-related companies would be compensated with mining rights. That doesn't seem to have taken place so far. But Mali has recently brought in a new mining code that would increase the state share of mines from 20% to 30% and add an extra 5% for unnamed Malian companies, which are thought to be perhaps companies acting on behalf of Wagner. And that is how Wagner could be compensated. It's unclear so far where the money flow is coming from, and therefore what's in it for Russia beyond that kind of desire to wrong foot the West that Leigh described. So as I said, I would read into this a system of a much larger and much more systemic failure. Russia and France have a long-standing rivalry in West Africa and in Mali going back into the 60s. France has usually had the upper hand. And while we can be highly critical of France's neo-colonial role in West Africa, which one can debate certain aspects of it. The CFA franc, for example. I think a case could be made that the CFA franc has brought financial stability and a convertible currency to a region which would otherwise not have one. It doesn't look very good. And there is a counter-analysis, which is that it is exploited. But the feeling among Malians and about many in West Africa is that it is neo-colonial. But there is despite all this, a much more nuanced attitude towards France than one might expect. Even an ambivalence. I noticed it when I was there, and it happened to be during, wasn't the World Cup, it was one of the big football fixtures in the European Cup. And to my surprise, Malians, young Malians, were cheering for Les Bleus. So that dynamic has gone on for a long time. I stumbled across an article from 1982 the other day. I don't know why I had it shoved in a drawer. Business Week, 1982, proclaiming the end of France Afrique. Well, that was 20 years after independence. We're now 60 years after independence. Maybe it was ever that soon. But there's another systematic failure, and it's on the part of the international community and particularly peace operations, where we have for some time now left the heavy lifting to South Asian and African countries who are doing most of the peacekeeping around the world and who often don't have the equipment to provide the mobility they need. Canada made a contribution right up into the end, a small one, but in 2018 to 2019, less than a year, we made this our first major peacekeeping contribution in a long time. It was the deployment of 200 to 250 personnel and 8 helicopters to Gao. And it was important, and it could have been transformative in allowing MINUSMA to patrol farther, to do more effective protection of civilians, in part by transporting to places where MINUSMA forces needed to go, but more importantly, to provide assurance of extraction, to be able to get wounded soldiers out in the golden hour when they can be saved, and that allowed risk-averse troop contributors to be more willing to be more aggressive in their patrols. Well, it was great while it lasted, but we were out after a year. There was, we were never fully replaced, and that was the extent of it. We remained there, as in many peace operations, with a token contribution, 5 or 6. I've never been anywhere where I didn't meet a force commander who, even when we had a handful of Canadians, would sort of spot me across the room and run over and thank Canada for its contribution. But we could have done a lot better than that. And I'll end with one anecdote about that contribution, and what I was saying earlier about InfoOps. The head of MINUSMA InfoOps while I was there happened to be Canadian. And she was a mechanical engineer, if I remember correctly. And because she was intelligent and innovative and hardworking, she did a pretty incredible job. But to me, it encapsulated this problem of putting talented amateurs with very little support and no Bambara language capacity and no other vernacular language capacity up against these massive Russian troll farms and bots who could generate tweets and WhatsApps and Facebooks and Instas by the gazillion. We just weren't competitive. And that is part of that failure, a failure to recognize the challenge and to see it through. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Scott. My apologies for the interruption. I was trying to be technologically more competent than I am. Okay, so our third speaker is Borges Nemere, and if he's ready to speak, he is. Great. He's nodding his head, so we're on to him. And when he is done with this, we'll see if Jeff is still with us. He was hoping to be on for a short period of time, and we don't know how long that will be. Okay, Borges, your turn.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I have a 5 slides presentation, if that's okay, just to support my brief presentation. So I'm trying to show it, yeah. Okay, so believing that you can see it. I will start by giving a brief background of Mozambique-Russia relationship. So I won't take long on it. This is just a history, and I think everyone knows. But maybe the most important here is to highlight that the relationship between Mozambique and Russia started during the colonial struggle when Russia supported Frelimo, the ruling party in Mozambique, seized independence, fighting against colonialism. So, and then following the independence, diplomatic relationships were established between Mozambique and Russia, and most of the Frelimo leaders were trained in Russia, including the militaries. But this relationship lasted until 1980, when Mozambique joined the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And then that is the same period with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then the support, the aid from Western countries overtook the role of Russia in Mozambique. Then followed a long period of very low relationship between the two countries until 2007, when Russia and Mozambique signed new agreements. This was basically economic agreement. So, okay. From this period, we go to what we can call as Russia return to Mozambique. This is a landed expression from Russia return to Africa. So in this period, the most remarkable event is the visit to Maputo by the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, on 2018. But also at that period, if you will remember, Russia was facing a kind of international isolation because of its role in the Syria war, but also the occupation of part of Ukrainian territories. Mozambique, by its side, was also facing a big challenge from their Western partners. It has to do with the hidden debt scandal. This is a very long story, but to make it short, it consists in 2 billion loan taken by Mozambique from international creditors, and then this was hidden to the monetary fund, to the International Monetary Fund, but also to Mozambican Parliament. So as a way to sanction Mozambique, the Western partners frozen the assistance to Mozambique, and that made Mozambique turn back to Russia. But also at the same period, Mozambique discovered large quantity, huge quantities of gas in northern part of the country, which attracted Russian company, but also Western companies. Then the most remarkable event was the visit of President Nyusi, president of Mozambique, to Russia to meet his counterpart Vladimir Putin. In that visit, several agreements were signed. So the security and defense agreement were signed in that period in 2019. And at the same time, at that period, also Mozambique was already facing radical insurgency in the northern part of the country, which started in 2017. But by 2019, this group, which is comprised by local militants, started to grow bold because it had support from Islamic State. So it started to grow in propaganda, but also in attacking skills. So the first country Mozambique looked to assist in terms of military assistance to face this group was Russia. When President Nyusi came back, announced agreement to forgive, to write off 90% of Mozambique debt with Russia. Also, energy agreements were announced with Russian giant companies, including Rosneft, Gazprom, and the Russian electricity company signing with their counterpart in Mozambique. Russian companies were awarded blocks for LNG project in northern Mozambique, which did not move too much so far, but they have this right. And then most important was the Defense Cooperation Agreement, signed in 2015, but was staying like frozen without being implemented. And from that visit of President Nyusi, then this agreement was implemented. This is what allowed the Wagner intervention in Mozambique. Mozambique, as I've said, is facing this insurgency since 2017. So under that agreement from 2015 and following the President Nyusi visit to Russia, then Russia decided to deploy to Cabo Delgado. So the deployment of Wagner troop was in September 2019. Initially, reports from local sources, the press in Mozambique was not allowed to go to that area to report what was happening. But then factual data now we can have, for example, that prior to this intervention, a Russian naval ship has offloaded in Pemba, in Cabo Delgado, bringing like the reconnaissance team. So the intervention itself, pictures have emerged So in these pictures, you can see it shows Mozambican military here. This is Nacala in northern Cabo Delgado. This is the Russian cargo which arrived there to bring material and men to Cabo Delgado. This was in a military base, but pictures have leaked, so this is one of it. It's not secret, so it's, everyone who do research have access to it. And there was a local company in Mozambique which is affiliated to Wagner called Lobai, which facilitated this very rapid deployment of Wagner to Cabo Delgado. So by that time, Wagner already had some roots in Mozambique. And what Wagner brought to Mozambique is a team of those who were described as highly trained military advisors, instructor who came to support Mozambique military. Basically, FADM means Mozambique Armed Defense Force, and the unity of rapid intervention, which is a police special unity, which is the one on the front line fighting this insurgency. So during the week of 15 to 22 September 2019, this number of advisors, trainers, counterinsurgency specialists were deployed to Cabo Delgado in a province called Mueda. There was an operational center. The number of the men deployed is of around 200, a little bit more. And according to eyewitness reports, they did travel by the road to Mueda in a distance of something like 500 kilometers by road. So they were seen by everyone with trucks and jeeps. But the most interesting is that once they arrived to Mueda, they were not well received by the local forces. So they did not get the support from local forces. The report says that this is because the Russian, they did not treat well their counterpart on the ground. So they didn't consider them really militarists. And then that frustrated the local troops, which didn't support them. So they were in Cabo Delgado for only 2 months for the intervention, and then they left without containing the threat of the insurgency. So they did not do their job. But also there are several confirmed reports of fatalities within Wagner ranks of almost more than 10 in only 2 months. So that is a huge number. And this is what precipitated Wagner to retreat, to leave Cabo Delgado. And these casualties and fatalities, according to reports, were caused because of the tension between Wagner and the Mozambique Armed Defense Force. The reason for that is what I have already explained. But the presence of Wagner in Cabo Delgado, that is my assumption, it has contributed to internationalize the conflict in Cabo Delgado. Because we'll remember that Wagner was fighting against ISIS in Syria. And then when a report came out to the international press that they came to Cabo Delgado to fight a local Islamist group, maybe the Wagner Group also, the Islamic State also increased their support to the local group, starting to claim attacks on a daily basis, but also providing training and somehow equipment to the local insurgent who pledged allegiance to Islamic State in the same period. Also, this is something that has been not very well discussed, but Wagner presence in Cabo Delgado also served to protect the general election in Mozambique, which took place in October. So in the second month of the presence of Wagner, there was the general election. General election is presidential, legislative, and governors. So what they have done is just to push back the insurgent from the towns and keep them confined in the bush by bombings and very huge operations to allow that Frelimo and President News could do campaign during that period. Campaign is 45 days for general election, so allowed the campaign to run without major problems. And then as soon as the election happened and the results were announced, they decided to withdraw. Wagner presence in the capital guard was also combined with the Russian interference to the general election in Mozambique by propaganda through Facebook, but also manipulating the software of vote tabulation. So it resulted in what is known by the different observers, including the European Union, the Commonwealth Observer. This is known as the most rigged election in Mozambique with interference of Russia. This is not discussed widely, but this is something that exists. So, well, that's all from my side, and I think we can discuss more from the debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Forges. Let's see now. Jeff, I think I still see you online. Do you want to, I know your time is short. Do you want to pitch in a question or two or a comment or two?
Yes, yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. I was especially happy with Borges' contribution just now because, I mean, there's lots of valuable information there. I mean, even as a journalist, I haven't seen all of that information before. But he also makes the important point that it was a very short-lived intervention by Wagner, just a couple of months in Mozambique. And I think we have to keep that in mind that, you know, there's a lot of maps floating around that show Wagner like all over Africa. And it's quite misleading. And, you know, people get this impression that, oh, Wagner is in, you know, 10 or 15 countries in Africa. But really, they only have a presence on the ground in 3 countries in Africa right now. That is Mali, Central African Republic, and Eastern Libya. Not even all of Libya, just the eastern part. You know, they are having an impact in a few other places, like, for example, helping to arrange military transfers into Sudan through Chad or through Libya. You know, they are supporting various factions in a few countries. And you know, but really, Wagner itself is only really on the ground in 3 countries now. And so we have to be quite skeptical about some of those maps that show it everywhere. What we're really talking about here is the more broad Russian presence, and you know, the fact that Russia's, you know, willingness to support, for example, coup leaders who come into power in places like Niger and Burkina Faso and so on recently, not just in Mali where they actually sent troops in, but just in terms of military equipment that they've sent in or diplomatic support at the UN for these new coup leaders in Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. I mean, that has been quite a significant impact. So I just wanted to make that distinction between Wagner's presence on the ground versus Russia's overall impact in Africa. They're sort of 2 different things. And you know, the fact that Russia was willing to offer a partnership with Burkina Faso and Niger as soon as those coups happened, even though they didn't send in Wagner troops, it really had an impact in terms of supporting those new military regimes. So that's something to keep in mind, that we're, you know, in a way, Wagner is just a proxy for Russian influence, and it's quite interesting to look at Russia's growing relationship with many African countries. Sorry, Marcia, if I could also, before I forget, before I leave, I wanted to just clarify from your introduction. I have not left the Johannesburg Bureau. I'm currently on temporary assignment in Jerusalem and in Israel, helping out with the coverage there. But I'm going back to Johannesburg when I finish my assignment here. So please, I don't want anyone to think that the Globe and Mail is shutting down its Africa Bureau. We're still committed. We're still going to cover it. If I could just move to a quick question, perhaps, that especially for Scott and Leigh. You know, I'm really interested in Canada's policy, and I think Scott talked about sort of the failures of that. Now I know we're talking about Wagner in Africa, but Wagner is also a symbol of the kind of the failure of Western policy in quite a few countries. And you know, even though, as I think Leigh or Scott mentioned, the Wagner is not really providing that great of a help in places like Mali and Central African Republic. There's evidence, in fact, that it's kind of losing some of the battles. It's losing, you know, Mali's military, which is in partnership with Wagner, is losing territory in Mali. So it's quite possible indeed that Wagner's security offer is not that good. It's not being that effective. But the reality is, having kicked France out of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso now, those new coup leaders have pretty well burned their bridges. They're not going to, they might bring, you know, they could theoretically bring France back in 10 or 20 years, but not in the short term. They've really burned their bridges. So those regimes are now stuck with Russia as their main security partner. And that's terrible for Canada's policy in the region. And I'd just like to quickly point out that Canada, over a period of 20 years, provided nearly $2.9 billion in development aid in those three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, all of which are now tilting towards Russia. And Canada has pretty well pulled out of all of those countries, except it does have an embassy still in Bamako, but you know, it's not even going to be in the UN peacekeeping force in Mali anymore, because that's coming closing by the end of the year. So you know, my just one contribution is I'd love to hear Leigh and Scott talk a bit about what, you know, whether Canada could have done anything differently besides just sort of automatically funding a lot of NGOs and relief agencies for many, many years in those three countries, and not really getting much influence out of it, not really stabilizing those countries, not really developing democracy, because the whole purpose of the aid from Canada, both development aid and security aid, was to stabilize those countries and to help entrench democracy. And none of that happened. So it may be time for Canada kind of to reassess its policy in those countries that are now tilting towards Russia. What could Canada have done differently? What was the failure? And you know, there's an argument that some analysts made in an article that I wrote recently that Canada should not have just allowed France really to run the show in those countries. And Canada, actually France and the US really took the lead on counterinsurgency, anti-terrorism, and so on. Could Canada have been maybe a bit less passive? Could it have taken a greater leadership role in the UN peacekeeping, or in some way in that region, maybe to become an alternative to France, which, you know, it's clear now that France was widely hated by a large segment of the population. So for Canada to hitch its wagon to France might have been a mistake. So I'd love to hear Leigh and Scott talk a bit about Canada's policy in the region and what Canada could have done differently, maybe to prevent Russia from ultimately gaining such influence.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to look at, I'm kind of looking at Leigh on the screen and Scott next to me. Which one of you wants to take up that challenge to answer that? Pointing to Scott. Okay.
I'll have something to add, but I think Scott should go first.
Okay, well, thanks. And to reply to your question, yeah, but on a couple of levels. One is, as you remarked, yeah, things aren't going so well. That what the Malian colonels have brought in is not serving their purposes. I didn't get into this, but I didn't get into the whole Tuareg dynamic. But the Tuareg, the CMA and the other Tuareg groups made it clear that bringing in Wagner was a deal breaker for them, and it's proven to be the case. And also the departure of MINUSMA, which is an indirect result of the Wagner deployment, means that those bases have now been surrendered to FAMA, and that's another stick in the eye for the Tuaregs. So the Tuareg rebellion is brewing up again, and meanwhile, the jihadis are making advances. And there was a piece in the BBC the other day saying Timbuktu and Gao are under siege. I think that was overstating it, but they are cut off by road today. So on a purely military basis, it's not going very well. What could Canada have done better? I mean, on our own, I don't think we could have avoided this, but we you know, as a part of a concert of nations, we could make more of a difference. I would differ, Jeffrey, with you when you say the whole purpose of our assistance in the Sahel is to support stability and democracy. That was one of the goals, surely, but the whole purpose was to address poverty and to make people's lives better. And I think it has borne some results in that area, not perhaps the sustainable results we want. But yes, I think we could have done more, particularly in the security realm, and that was what I meant about our contribution to MINUSMA. It could have been considerably larger in scale, and it could have been, more importantly, of longer duration. And that could have been an enabler to allow MINUSMA to provide a kind of stability that Mali needed so much. A muscular military presence can make a huge difference. I'll mention just one contribution, which I think was the sort of thing we should have been emulating, and it was the UK contribution in Gao with the long-range reconnaissance patrol, which sounds like a bunch of guys going out with binoculars and looking around, but it meant much more. It was an approach taken by the UK presence, which was not huge, but which provided a degree of stability, not just along the roads they were patrolling, but several hundred kilometers on either in either direction, and provided a degree of surety to civilian populations that they weren't otherwise going to get. And if there had been that kind of contribution by more Western countries, Canada included, we might have seen a very different outcome in Mali. But it's not looking good. And as you said, I can't see the way out for the current Malian leaders.
Leigh, did you want to make a comment or?
Ever so briefly, just because I can't add to what Scott, who is so familiar with our approach to Africa, said about Africa specifically. But Jeff having opened the door to Leigh, what do you think about Canadian foreign policy? I would say in general, that we really, not with regard to Africa, but with the whole world, we need to get much more serious. I would quote, while Scott was speaking, I was able to pick up there was a piece in the Globe just the other day arguing along the lines that I've personally been arguing for some time, that I recommend to the audience. The authors of this piece contend that Canada's foreign policy has too often become purely performative, embracing ear candy sound bites designed to make Canadians feel good about themselves, rather than putting in the hard work of crafting policy for an unpleasant and increasingly dangerous world. And certainly in my long, dare I say, experience of our approach to Russia before the war, I strongly support, I think I love the fact that we are all in our support for Ukraine, but that in general, I see, Canada continuing to coast on the coattails of American power as it once was, rather than it currently is, which means that foreign policy has become too much a realm for our political level to pander shamelessly to domestic constituencies, rather than take a hard look at the world as it is, not as it once was, and communicate to and educate Canadians and act accordingly on the fact that the world has changed, it's a difficult place, and we've got to get serious and be in for the long haul. End of sermon. That would be what I would add. Thanks.
Thanks, Leigh. Thanks very much. I think we're going to take the opportunity to look around the table and see if people who are actually here turned up for the in-person session. If you have a question you would like to pose to the panelists. Yes.
Hi, I'm Margaret Scott, and I just wanted to comment on Leigh Sarty's comments, if I could. And in general, Leigh and I met while we were both working on the Moscow file a long time ago, Peter MacArthur as well. The empires have been involved, Russia and France in particular, have been involved in Africa for a long time, 1700s. And I'm not asking a question, I just wanted to make a couple of comments, three comments. The Russian Empire had hired mercenaries in Africa long time ago, specifically one group, the Don Cossacks. The Soviet Union provided amazing scholarships and opportunities to students from Africa and from Nicaragua. In Ottawa, we will meet doctors, dentists, optometrists who are from Nicaragua and Africa, who are fabulously trained in Moscow and St. Petersburg. What happened, however, after the coup in '91, there was no money to bring those students back to Nicaragua and Africa. And what happened then to those students, starving and hungry and unable to return home, was quite sad. And that was a vacuum that was left after the '91 coup. And the third pillar was religion. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union allowed the Polish Red Cross to go into some of the labor camps and concentration camps and remove their citizens. And they went to Africa as long as they didn't go back to any of the Soviet countries. Well, amongst those who came out to Africa were also ethnic Russians, etc. So one of the other pillars that Russia has used is religion, and specifically Orthodoxy in Ethiopia and Uganda. So education, religion, and mercenaries were always the three pillars. And somebody the other day said, corruption targets for resource-rich, governance-poor countries. That happens consistently. And someone else commented, I can never take credit for brilliance, that money and capacity that we give to food insecurity and stability does not necessarily and often has no linkage to creating and buying reforms in vulnerable countries. Thank you. And Leigh and Peter, I don't know if you agree with me, or this is your first opportunity to disagree with me.
I agree.
Thank you.
I
Yes.
think time is short for questions, so I appreciate the comments, Margaret, but we should, and hello, but let's give some others a chance to ask questions.
Yes, we have one more question here.
Thank you, Adam. So my question is in regards to, so Wagner is officially a PMC. And I just wanted to know if it is in the world situation right now, especially in Africa, is there actually a market for PMCs? Is it economically sustainable, or do you sort of need that state support that Wagner has to be a PMC in these days? And with that, how big can the PMC be?
It's a good question. I had wondered about the PMC analogy here too. I'm not sure any of our panelists feel comfortable at responding to that, but they might want to speak more about, I would think, the even more complex PMC in terms of the bigger package. Because it's not just the military that the Wagner grants, but it's info ops and it's computer analysis. It's, as Borges is talking about, its potential role in the elections in Mozambique in this case, but I'm sure in others as well. So it's even more than your classic PMC, which is mostly the military end. That's just a comment. So
Yeah, I mean, briefly, as I mentioned, I'm not sure how they're finding the 10 million to pay Wagner, but I don't think the offer would be all attractive if it were confined to just military operations. It's because it's that full service offer, including the diplomatic support and the info ops, that it becomes a more appealing one. But I'm guessing here there must be some kind of tolerance for, let's say, late payment or I just don't see how it could be sustained.
Yes, question.
Hi, thank you to all our panelists for your time. My name is Philip Lois. I'm a master's student in European, Russian, and Eurasian studies, just downstairs. I had a question for Dr. Sarty as well as Dr. Proudfoot. In terms of China's involvement in Africa, which is obviously makes big headlines constantly, how have they reacted, or how has Wagner's operations in Africa affected their interests? And then to the Canadian front, obviously Canada has an economic presence there too. Same question: how has Wagner's involvement in Africa affected Canadian economic enterprises there?
Perhaps one more question.
I will ask a question, and then my question would be for Borges. One of the main issues when it comes to Russia and Wagner in Africa is the system, the wide coordinated system of disinformation. Can you tell us something about this? Because I know that in Mozambique and in the sub-region and in its totality, Africa had this problem of disinformation, fighting about the Russian disinformation in Africa. Can you tell us something about this?
Okay.
Borges.
And let's take one third question, and then we'll ask various people to respond, because we only have a little bit of time left.
I just realizing that I was with my husband Tim Shaw at a BRICS meeting in China about maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and the countries involved: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It was a very it was one of those amazing experiences where you can see the way in which these connections were working on attitudes towards sharing of students going in the different countries, all kinds of different things going on in that particular set of countries that most of us don't. I mean, I was only there because Tim Shaw, my husband, was there. And so it is, but it would be very interesting to try and find some people who were part of that to analyze how they think it was and how it has changed all of these countries involved.
I mean, I think a discussion of BRICS would be a great one for a
I should
future
ask
session.
Tim Shaw.
Okay.
It was quite amazing.
Okay, so we have a limited amount of time left. Borges, you haven't spoken much, so maybe we could have you start with, if you could give a response to Sheikh's question, and then we could wrap up with the other question about economic interests in the region.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. Regarding the disinformation, well, Mozambique, just like other African countries, is fertile ground for that. People are poorly instructed, so they tended to believe in everything, but also there is no fact check mechanism. So one of the remarkable situation which came with the Russians was during the 2019 election. There's a Russian Electoral Observation Organization, which prior to the polls, they have just announced results saying that the President Nyose, who is the Frelimo candidate, would win the election with 73%. And that is not allowed in Mozambique by law. So Mozambican legislation prohibits this kind of studies or forecast of the election results. But that was published through Facebook. So without legislation which punished this kind of publication by Facebook, nothing could be done. No one could believe on that because the popularity of the government at that time was so high. And what happened is that effectively President Nyusi won the election with almost 75%. That was a surprise to everyone. So it seems like after the election, now people understand that this was kind of a testing the public opinion to see how people react, because that is what they were planning to do. And as I've said before, this is the most this was the most rigged election in Mozambican history of democracy, with more than 30 years. But also the way it's used to manipulate information. There's a lot of fake news in Mozambique, in Facebook and other social networks. And there's no verification mechanism as well. Like the government doesn't have, or other independent entities, a kind of fact check website where if you find information, you can go there to verify, which happens in different countries. So there's a lot of propaganda, but at this point, I cannot directly link that to the Russian presence in Mozambique, except that situation of election studies, which was not allowed by law, but also brought results, unexpected results, but that was later confirmed from the polls, of course, with all this rigging problem. But if you allow me also, Chair, I see there a question from Roy talking about the 2 billion debt of Mozambique. So I think the question is their kind of forgiveness for this debt, if that is the question. This is not possible because this is a commercial debt. So it's not a debt from states, concessional debt. This is commercial debt from Credit Suisse and VTB. So what Mozambique is doing now is challenging the debt in a lawsuit in a commercial court in London. So the trial started today. Mozambique is trying to get this debt nullified because in order to be contracted, employees from Credit Suisse, but also from the shipbuilding company, which was aimed to provide equipment to Mozambique with this debt, they bribed Mozambican senior officials, including the former Minister of Finance, Manuel Chang, who is since July in the US, extradited there to be tried in connection with this case. Thank you.
Okay, Scott, Leigh, there was a big, interesting question being posed here about economic interest. I'm not sure we can get into China at this point, but maybe you have a final comment at some point to make before we.
I'll quickly say, just China is a big issue, and a great question. Sorry, I have not looked specifically at what China is saying about Wagner, but I think Africa is an interesting subset of the broader question of China-Russia relations. Note Putin's in Beijing as we speak for the Belt and Road Summit, and just one should always be wary. I think that China, remember, I saw it just written, its economic interests in Africa are at least 10 times greater than Russia's. Maybe that's probably an underestimate, that we always have to measure China's just incredible economic clout and how it brings that to bear in ways that Russia can't dream of. That said, the two sides do share that anti-Western agenda. And so it's the potential conflict between those two shared interests against the West versus the kind of differences that inevitably emerge between two great powers that are worth watching in Africa and elsewhere.
The question about Canadian economic involvement and interest. The two aspects of that. One is the development assistance. That is, some of that was put on hold after the first coup, but that in that region is inevitably going to trail off. But there are Canadian companies that are among the biggest investors in Mali, particularly in the mining sector, particularly in gold. That hasn't changed. But I think what you're going to see is no new investment, not because of instability, not because of Wagner directly, but because of the new mining code, which makes it less attractive. And in a high risk zone, it just cuts the margin too tight. But the question reminds me of sort of a lack of overall strategic engagement in Africa, something that Jeffrey had asked about. What might have we done differently? We have across the board in Africa for years, lots of diplomatic engagement, including at the most senior level. You saw this in 2020, where the year leading up to the Security Council election, which we lost, we had the Prime Minister to go to a AU summit once, and the Foreign Minister of the day go to all of Africa once. Well, we saw the results. Lastly, China. Leigh contrasted China's huge commercial presence in Africa with Russia's almost non-existent one. I think that is actually part of the strength of the Russian offer, because it's small baggage and it's symbolic, and part of the strength of it is its emptiness. You can go to that symbolic alternative because it brings nothing with it.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take this time because we're out of time, and thank you very much all for participating. Borges, thank you very much for coming from Maputo in late evening time. You can have dinner now. The rest of us maybe a late lunch.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to turn to Sheikh for 1 second to let him do a formal.
Thank you so much, Marcia. As usual, very excellent moderation. I used to say that we have many people, African specialists, but I have to say again, you are one of the best. And that's why the Africa Study Group is very happy to have you. And we count on you for the next years, and then we hope we will be able to organize more events like this one. Of course, when we have this kind of event, we cannot discuss all the issues because there are so many of them. But our goal is somehow to change the perception by bringing effective information, to change the perception, with the goal eventually to change the perspectives. And we hope that people who are listening to us will have the possibility to think about this. We will continue our discussion, and I hope that you have been able to learn something from us. We had today, I believe, 120 people who registered in Canada, and I know that we have also people from Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. They told me yesterday night that they are going to come together as a group in order to listen to this webinar. We are happy. In Sudan, a group of students told me that they are coming together, and I hope they have been able to do it because they had some problem of electricity, which is heartbreaking for me. But we have recorded these sessions, and we will make sure that we put it in our website for those fans, so that they can see this very serious discussion. On behalf of the Africa Study Group and on behalf of NPSIA, I would like to thank our panelists for their excellent presentation. Ambassador Scott, Mr. Leigh Sarty, Borges in Maputo, and Geoffrey, please stay safe.
Yes.
I want to get the opportunity to continue reading your papers. As I said, please note that this session has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page and on the YouTube page of the Canadian National Council. Many of our people our members have been calling us and sending us emails asking us to talk about Sudan. And I promise you we will do it. But sometimes it's very important to do this kind of session at the right time. It has to be constructive, and it doesn't have to be negative to what is happening right now in Sudan, even the fact that we even don't have all the information. If we organize an event on Sudan, we want that event to be a peace building. and peace consolidation event, and not the opposite. So I promise you, we will do that at the right time. I would like to thank our colleagues, Matt Puya, Communication Director of Africa Study Group, as well as our colleagues, Olivia Lazali, Maria Safka, Arnel Akut-Beto, Cameron Christie, and Yeshua Adams at CSC National Capital Branch for all the effort that went into organizing this session. Merci to Anne and Nipsha for this great partnership, for hosting us here. The next Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council will be announced on our website, but I can already tell you that we are planning to organize something on the 14th of November as a prelude to the COP28. We want to discuss
Climate change.
climate change issues and to see what our Canadian perspective and what are the African perspective.
14th of
November.
November 2023. This will be all for today. I wish you good health, and depending on where you are, in Maputo, here in Ottawa, in Joburg and Jerusalem, I wish you a good day, good afternoon, and good night. Merci et à la prochaine.
Thank you.